A salesman at a luxury dealership judged a poorly dressed man and called him a time waster, but 20 minutes later, he realized that man was Keanu Reeves, and by then, it was too late, not just for the sale, but for his reputation. It was a bright Monday morning in Los Angeles, and the luxury car dealership looked perfect in every possible way. Sunlight streamed through the massive glass walls, reflecting off floors so polished they looked like mirrors. Every car inside was positioned with precision, as if it were part of an art exhibition rather than a showroom. A bold red sports car stood near the entrance, designed to grab attention instantly. Along one side, silver sedans were lined up with quiet elegance, while on the other side, black SUVs gave off a strong and commanding presence. But in the center of the showroom, under carefully focused lighting, stood the most important vehicle of them all, a black performance car that symbolized power, status, and wealth. Soft music played gently in the background, and the air carried the rich scent of leather and new interiors. The salesmen were ready, dressed in sharp suits, polished shoes, and expensive watches, standing beside the cars with confident smiles. But their attention was selective. They were not just looking for customers, they were looking for customers who looked like money. Most of the people walking in that morning fit that image perfectly, well-dressed individuals, business professionals, and confident buyers who carried themselves with status. Near the front desk stood Brian, a 35-year-old salesman who had spent 6 years building his reputation at the dealership. He believed he had mastered the art of reading people. In his mind, it only took a few seconds to decide whether someone was serious or just wasting time. At exactly 10:07 a.m., the glass door opened quietly, and a tall man walked in. He didn't rush or look around nervously. Instead, he moved calmly, almost as if he already understood the environment. His appearance, however, did not match the luxury around him. He wore a simple dark jacket, a plain gray shirt, faded jeans, and old boots that had clearly been used many times. His hair was slightly messy, and his beard was natural, giving him a very ordinary look. One salesman glanced at him briefly and then looked away, already uninterested. Another whispered that he was probably just browsing. Brian looked at him for a second and immediately made his decision. Not a buyer. He quietly told his coworker not to waste time on him. The man, unaware of these judgments, began walking through the showroom slowly, observing everything with calm focus. He didn't touch anything carelessly or act overly impressed. Instead, he looked closely, like someone studying details rather than dreaming about them. He stopped near the red sports car, examined the wheels, then moved on without saying anything. Brian watched him from a distance, slightly annoyed, mentioning that if the manager noticed, he might have to go and deal with him. The man eventually reached the center of the showroom and stopped in front of the black performance car. This time, he stayed longer. He walked around it slowly, studying its design, its curves, and its details with quiet interest. Brian sighed and muttered that he was just another dreamer. But across the showroom, the manager had already noticed. With a single look, he signaled Brian to go and assist. Brian adjusted his tie, forced a professional smile, and walked over. In a slightly dry tone, he asked if he could help. The man turned calmly and said he wanted to test drive the car. Brian was surprised and questioned if he was serious, reminding him that the car was extremely expensive. The man simply replied that he knew. Brian smirked and made a careless comment that most people dressed like him were just dreamers. The words hung in the air, but the man didn't react emotionally. He simply repeated that he was interested in the test drive. That calm confidence irritated Brian, but with the manager watching, he had no choice. He agreed and told the man to follow him, unaware that this simple interaction was about to turn into a moment that would change his perspective forever. Hay stepped outside into the sunlight, where the black performance car stood shining like a trophy in the front row of the dealership. Brian unlocked it with a soft click and handed over a quick instruction before asking for the driver's license. The man handed it calmly, and Brian glanced at it briefly, feeling a strange sense of familiarity, but he didn't focus long enough to realize why. He returned it and gestured toward the driver's seat. The man opened the door slowly and sat down with natural confidence, adjusting the seat and mirrors as if he had done it many times before. Brian walked around and sat in the passenger seat, expecting hesitation or nervousness. But instead, he saw steady hands on the steering wheel. The engine started with a deep, controlled sound, and as they pulled out of the lot, Brian crossed his arms and began speaking in a slightly arrogant tone. He mentioned that the car wasn't for everyone and that it required serious drivers with experience. The man simply nodded and focused on the road. As they reached the main street, the car moved smoothly through traffic, responding perfectly to every movement. The man drove with calm precision, turning effortlessly and maintaining control without any sign of struggle. Brian watched closely, his confidence slowly starting to fade. This wasn't how an inexperienced driver behaved. After a few minutes, Brian tried again, saying that most people who test drove this car couldn't even afford the down payment. The man replied quietly that it was interesting, without showing any emotion. That simple response made Brian feel slightly uncomfortable. At a red light, Brian glanced sideways again, studying the man's face more carefully. It looked familiar, but he still couldn't place it. When the light turned green, the man pressed the gas gently, and the car accelerated smoothly without any sudden movement. They continued driving in silence for a while until Brian asked if he had driven something like this before. The man replied that he had, but didn't give details. When asked what kind, he simply said different kinds. That vague answer frustrated Brian because it revealed nothing. Soon, they reached an open stretch of road, and Brian told him to go ahead and feel the power of the car. The man checked his surroundings carefully and pressed the pedal slightly harder. The car responded instantly, accelerating with smooth and controlled force. Brian felt himself pushed slightly into the seat, and for the first time, he realized something important. This man wasn't guessing. He knew exactly what he was doing. After nearly 20 minutes, they turned back toward the dealership. Brian tried to regain control of the situation by mentioning that if he was serious, they could discuss pricing once they returned. The man didn't respond. When they parked, it was done perfectly in one smooth movement. Brian forced a confident smile and asked what he thought. The man looked at the car carefully and said it was good. Encouraged, Brian suggested moving forward with paperwork, but instead, the man calmly declined. He said he wouldn't be buying today. The words caught Brian off guard. He quickly asked why, but the man simply turned and began walking back toward the showroom. Something didn't feel right. Brian followed him, calling out for him to wait. When the man turned in the sunlight, Brian finally saw him clearly, and in that moment, everything changed. The face that had seemed familiar suddenly became clear. It was Keanu Reeves. Brian's confidence disappeared instantly, replaced by shock and regret. Brian stood frozen as realization hit him all at once, his mind replaying every word he had said earlier. His tone, his assumptions, his careless remark calling the man a dreamer, it all came rushing back. He struggled to find words and finally admitted that he hadn't recognized him. Keanu remained calm, his expression unchanged, which somehow made the situation feel even heavier. Brian quickly tried to explain himself, saying he hadn't meant anything by it and that dealing with customers sometimes led to such behavior. Keanu listened quietly and then asked a simple question that struck deeply. He asked if Brian treated every customer that way. Brian hesitated because he knew the answer. Sometimes he did. He gave a weak denial, but his voice lacked confidence. Keanu nodded and said that everyone deserved respect. The sentence was simple, but it carried weight. It wasn't loud or angry, but it stayed in Brian's mind instantly. At that moment, the manager approached quickly, trying to recover the situation. He greeted Keanu respectfully and offered assistance, but Keanu declined politely, stating that the car was excellent, but service mattered more than the machine. That sentence felt like a final judgment. Before leaving, he looked at Brian and said he hoped the next customer would feel welcome. Then he walked away. Brian stood there, watching him leave, feeling smaller than ever. The manager turned to him with disappointment and asked what had happened. Brian tried to explain that he didn't know who the customer was, but the manager interrupted, making it clear that it didn't matter. What mattered was how he had treated him. Brian lowered his head, realizing the truth. This wasn't about losing a sale. It was about his behavior. He walked back into the showroom slowly, feeling the weight of his mistake. The same environment that had once made him feel confident now felt uncomfortable. A coworker asked what happened, and Brian simply said he made a mistake. For the rest of the day, he struggled to focus. Every customer made him pause and rethink his approach. Around noon, a simple-looking couple entered. Brian felt his old instinct rising, but this time he stopped himself. He approached them politely and helped them without judgment. They didn't buy anything, but they thanked him sincerely. That small moment stayed with him. Later, the manager called him into the office and asked a direct question. If the man had not been famous, would you have treated him differently? Brian wanted to say yes, but he couldn't lie. He admitted the truth. The manager gave him a final warning but didn't fire him. That moment marked the beginning of change. Over the next few days, Brian's mindset began to shift. It wasn't sudden, but it was real. Every time a customer walked in, he caught himself before making assumptions. One morning, a man wearing dusty boots entered the showroom, looking unsure of himself. Brian immediately walked over and welcomed him warmly. The man admitted he didn't feel like he belonged there, but Brian reassured him that everyone did. They spoke for nearly an hour, and although the man didn't buy anything, he left with genuine appreciation. That moment gave Brian a sense of pride he hadn't felt in years. Later that week, an older man entered wearing simple clothes and quietly looked at a silver performance car. Brian approached him respectfully and explained everything patiently. The man listened carefully and eventually asked for the final price. After hearing it, he calmly pulled out a checkbook and decided to buy the car. Brian was surprised but remained professional. As the man signed the papers, he mentioned that he had heard about the earlier incident. Brian felt embarrassed but admitted his mistake. The man nodded and said that what mattered was what he did after it. He added that he chose to buy because he felt respected. Those words meant more to Brian than the sale itself. As the customer drove away, Brian realized something important. Respect builds trust, and trust builds success. Over the next weeks, more customers began responding positively to his approach. Some even asked for him by name. He treated everyone equally, regardless of how they looked. A young woman in gym clothes bought a high-end SUV. A quiet businessman ordered multiple cars. Each experience reinforced the same lesson. It wasn't about appearance. It was about respect. Brian finally understood that his job wasn't just selling cars. It was creating an experience. Weeks later, Brian had completely changed, not just in behavior but in mindset. The showroom looked the same, but he saw it differently now. He no longer judged people based on appearance. Instead, he focused on how he made them feel. One day, a new trainee joined the dealership, full of confidence and quick to judge customers. Brian recognized himself in him and offered simple advice. Treat every customer like they matter. The trainee asked if that included people who didn't look like buyers. Brian smiled and said especially them. That lesson stayed with the trainee, just as it had stayed with Brian. That evening, Brian watched a television interview featuring Keanu Reeves. Seeing him again reminded Brian of how much that one moment had changed him. He didn't feel regret anymore. He felt gratitude. That encounter had taught him something he had never learned in 6 years of work. The next day, Brian returned to the dealership with a calm and steady mindset. He greeted every customer with the same respect, and he noticed how differently people responded. They trusted him more. They stayed longer. They felt comfortable. As the day ended, Brian stood outside the dealership and looked at the road where everything had changed. He understood now that success wasn't just about sales. It was about character. It was about consistency. It was about treating every person with dignity. Somewhere in the city, Keanu continued his life, unaware of the impact he had made. But for Brian, that moment had changed everything, because sometimes losing a sale teaches more than closing one. Sometimes walking away leaves a stronger message than staying. And sometimes, in a place filled with the most expensive things, the most valuable thing of all costs nothing at all. Respect.